Hello and welcome to another Battle Cup Histories video. If you're new here, click that subscribe button, go on, click it. And today we'll be talking to a Cold War tank commander. I'd like to introduce my Uncle Chris. So we're going to do a few questions today, and firstly just give a brief overview of your life in the army.
In 1956, when I first joined up for the army, there was something called national service in Great Britain. That meant that everybody only boys, no girls, old boys over the age of 18 were called up for 2 years in the armed services. If you had a disability, you managed to get out of it. There were certain reasons why you might avoid that, but it never occurred to me to try. So we were called up and had to go up to Catterick Camp in Yorkshire with a lot of other people who had no experience of army life at all. Some had never left their homes before. On the first night in the barracks, more than one person cried themselves to sleep, bearing in mind these were young men of 18 or even 19. And it was a curious situation, which I say it was only for boys. Girls, for some reason, weren't called up, because in those days there were no women in the armed forces other than in a secretarial role. I chose the Royal Tank Regiment to join because I had an uncle who had been a serving officer in the army, and he said that I recommend you join the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment because the commanding officer is an old friend of mine. Jock Holden, his name was, and if you go, when you're called up, you'll be asked, have you any preference where to go? So I said I wanted to go to the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment, and whenever I was asked the question, what happens if you're commissioned, what would you like to go to, I would say the same thing. So by dint of repeating the same answer, I wound up in the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment in Germany at the end of 1956.
So we're going to go over to a few questions which you've answered already. So we're skipping out the first question because you already answered it, which was, when did you join the army? As you said, 1956. What tank did you command?
Well, I commanded, there was a troop of 3 tanks. They were Centurion Mark 7s, if my memory serves me correctly. The Centurion tank, which was introduced at the very end of the Second World War, or just after it, was a brilliant tank, one of the best ever made. And the Mark 7 meant that this was the 7th tank of that type which had been introduced. It either had a different engine or different armour. So there were variations on the theme. So that, in my regiment, there were, broadly speaking, only Centurion tanks, but there was one company of what were called Conqueror tanks. They were curious, very, very large, very wide tracks, and had a very big gun. They were never a great success.
And what rank were you?
I was a 2nd lieutenant when I was commissioned. I went in as a trooper. In the lowest rank of the army, you were either a private or a trooper, or in the RAF. There was another rank, I can't remember what that was. But so anybody entering the army originally joined either as a private in the normal foot regiments or as a trooper in the armoured corps, which was the cavalry and the Royal Tank Regiment. So I was a trooper.
What was the longest amount of time you've stayed in a tank, and what was it like?
I don't think I spent more than about 6 or 8 hours in a tank at any one time. There were occasions when people went on what were called lockdown manoeuvres, whereby you shut down the lid of the tank, everybody shut down, and you just survived somehow for 24 hours, which must have been desperately uncomfortable. But no more than shut down. Now, by shut down means that the commander of the tank usually had the opening in the top of the tank, called a cupola, which was a steel door on a hinge. So you tended to have your head out of the top of the tank, and behind you, looking forwards, there was this armoured disc, which was the hatch. The signaller was beside you on your left, the gunner was to your right and in front of you, and the driver was in a separate compartment in the front of the tank. So there were 4 of us, each with our own duties, and all the tank commander was responsible for telling or giving orders to the others. And he in turn got orders from the troop commander or the company commander or the regimental commander, as the case may be.
How loud is it inside the tank?
Very loud, particularly if you're firing a gun, of course, because the gunfire is extremely loud, but that was something one very rarely did. In wartime, of course, that would have been a normal thing to do, but it was very noisy when you're moving along. There's a large steel box, in effect, with a huge diesel engine behind you. So it was pretty noisy, and the tank tracks themselves creaked and groaned as you went along.
Where were you sent in the tank?
Well, when I joined up, I went to Catterick in Yorkshire, did my basic training. Then I went down to Lulworth, to the what is now the Tank Museum at Bovingdon, where I did the training, the tank training, as opposed to the normal walking up and down or marching up and down, learning how to salute, how to turn left, how to turn right, and do all those sort of things. And we went to Bovingdon, where we had, I suppose, 6 or 8 weeks, I can't remember, maybe longer, where we learnt what a tank was like, how do we do it, what the commands were, what to do, particularly with radio communication. Now, you're locked up in a steel box, your other tanks in the troop may be 100 yards away, 200 or 300 metres away. So you did everything by wireless, and there was a procedure which you had to follow. So if you occasionally listen to a Hollywood movie, they say over and out when they finish the conversation. You never say over and out, you say over. Unless it's the end of the conversation when you say out, but you never say over and out. So there would be my radio operator on my left, and I would have my microphone on my chest, and you get an order from the company commander or the regimental commander, and every day before you set out you had to do something called radio signalling, wireless communication. So you had to, somebody would read out a series of things and you had to say yes or whatever, and until the whole of that area of troops, that regiment or company or whatever it is, were all tuned into the same frequency on the radio, so you could communicate to everybody. So that was the first and most miserable job of the day, because there was somebody who hadn't pressed the button and couldn't do the procedure properly.
Were there any other corps that you were thinking of joining other than the tank corps?
Not really. I couldn't be caught up into anything. There were 3 services. There was the Royal Navy, the Army, and the Royal Air Force. It never occurred to me to join anything other than the Army, and I suppose, given this uncle of mine, who was a regular soldier, had recommended this, it seemed to me that was the obvious choice. So I never really considered anything else. And in a way, of course, if you're determined to do something, you generally do. If you're undecided, that's where you go.
How reliable was the Centurion?
I never had much problem with it. They were pretty reliable. The problem with all tanks is that the track, which is made of steel, wears out where the links of the tracks go together. They're pinned together with a steel pin. They gradually wear, and wear quite quickly at times, so you had to take up the slack on the tank track, otherwise you get a sort of droopy track. And you had to adjust the tension of the track. So it's a curious creature, very noisy, very squeaky, and need an enormous amount of maintenance.
And for the interval, we're going to see if you can fit back in your old uniform.
Well, there's a thing. It's got bigger. No, the hat stroke, sorry. There we go. Right.
And
Now then, Corporal.
fit into the...
That is a different matter altogether. Now, you understand that this, I have not put on any weight during this period, but this is made of cotton and wool, a mixture which is notoriously prone to shrinking. And it may well be that whilst my own stomach is as lean and hard and taut as it ever was, this blouse appears to have shrunk a little bit, and may not fit quite as well as it used to. In fact, It's hardly sits at all. But if I stand at a slight angle to the camera, you'll see that nothing has changed really at all. And I would have had, of course, battle dress trousers as well. But this is what might be called the everyday uniform of an officer and indeed a trooper in the regiment. The only difference between that of an officer and trooper was the epaulets. And if you were a non-commissioned officer, you had stripes, chevrons. If you were just a trooper, you didn't have anything, so you were just a dog's body. And you had ordinary, what were called ammunition boots, which are army boots. And the trousers were the same uniform. But in the tank itself, you tended to wear something called a tank suit, which is a one-piece set of overalls, in effect. It would be black, because you were in the tank corps, or the Royal Tank Regiment, so it had to be black. And that was an overall, it's just like the painter's overalls, for want of a better word. You climbed into it, zipped it up, and that's what you wore when you were going into action, as it were. And they also used to have a very cold weather set of tank suits, which were made if you were fighting in extremely cold conditions. And this was like the ordinary zip-up one, but it was very thick and quilted. But that's what, when, as I say, when you were in the everyday life in the regiment, as an ordinary trooper or as a young officer, you'd be wearing very much the same as I have on now. If you were going into having a smart parade, you might wear a smarter uniform. And in the evenings, you would wear a blue, what were called blues, which was a blue uniform. So there were variations of the same thing.
And for the final question, do you have any funny memories you'd like to share?
Oh yes, I think it's I was very lucky. I joined the army, I joined the regiment in peacetime. There were areas of conflict, and at more or less the same time as I joined the army, the Suez crisis occurred. And this was when the British government, in conjunction with the French, decided to take over the Suez Canal, which was privately owned and had recently been taken over by the government of Egypt. And the French and the British and the Israelis, I think, decided they would try and take back the Suez Canal. And when I was sent to Catterick first, the tanks at the regiment next door were being painted a sort of sand yellow rather than the sort of olive green, which is the usual painting camouflage of a tank. And it was widely believed that they were going to go off somewhere in the Middle East. I would love to have gone, because that would have been a real battle. And of course, people like me who've never heard a shot fired in anger always feel, what a pity I didn't have a chance to see if I would have run for cover or kept a stiff upper lip.
And any other memories you had?
I've got so many memories. A lot of the life in the peacetime army was very routine. You had regular drills. You couldn't afford to have too much diesel. There was always a shortage of fuel, so you couldn't drive the tanks around as much as you'd like. So it was a question of keeping everybody happy and the tank cleaned and polished, and that used to take a lot of time. And you would also, as a junior officer, you'd have this troop which had perhaps 4 tanks in it, so that would be, 16 people. And you would say, what on earth am I going to do with them for the day? And we'd go off to a lecture hall and you'd talk about something or other, about tactics or something, and you'd try to keep them awake, but they're all sitting there going, and I would at that point say, right, everybody on your feet, run around the block twice, wake up. So they would all go running around the block and come down. So peacetime army could be very boring and routine. It was always one wanted to go into action, but I suspect the moment you went into action, you rather thought it would be nice to go back to the routine of barracks. But it was a curious existence. The most important person in the regiment was the regimental sergeant major, a formidable man who'd come up through the ranks and seemed very old, but was probably in his middle 40s. He'd seen action everywhere, and he ran the regiment in a practical sense. The commanding officer was a lieutenant colonel, much superior in rank to him, but in terms of the daily life of the regiment, the RSM was the man that really was to be feared, whether you were a trooper or an officer. He was always a very fierce man.
What is tank training like?
Well, the initial training in the army was the walking, the marching and so on, as I think I may have said. But learning the tank was basically, you're given a lecture beforehand explaining what a tank is, how it works, it's a diesel engine and roughly this. Then you're then taken out into a tank with an instructor. And there'll be a driver provided and a gunner and all the rest of things. And he would sit beside you and say, now these are the commands you have to go. So when you want to move ahead, bear in mind that the tank is quite a small, compact place to be, and the driver who's at the front can hardly hear what you're saying because of the noise of the engine. So everything is done through a microphone held to the mouth. So you would say, driver advance, and he would then move forward, and then you say driver left or driver right to tell him which way to go. On a normal track, it would be obvious, you kept going along the track. But if you wanted to leave the track, you would say, driver, turn left, and then he'd go off into the open country. Then, if you wanted to speak to other tanks in your thing, you'd signal, and your signaller beside you would make sure the thing was tuning and the radio was working properly. And I had another 2 tanks, or 3 underneath my command. So you would tell them what to do. So I'd be telling my driver, go left, and then I'd say to the rest of the troop, in 100 yards, all go left, or driver so-and-so, stay still or we'll go round you. So you give commands to this little group of people, and further up the chain of command, there'll be the company commander, who will be telling several troops what to do, and then the regimental commander, who is telling the company commanders. So it was a sort of hierarchy, and at the very bottom was really the ordinary trooper.
So what rank would you have to be to command your own tank?
Well, you'd be, in the case of
the lowest rank.
Well, the lowest rank which you could command your own tank was effectively, I think, a corporal, might in special circumstances. Generally speaking, it was a sergeant. The troop leader, troop commander, was a second lieutenant. He might have been slightly higher rank, but he might have been a full lieutenant. But after that, the lowest rank was, I think, sergeant. There may have been circumstances where a corporal, which was 2 stripes on the arm, as opposed to 3 stripes of a sergeant, could command a tank. But he took instructions from the next one up, and for the troop commander then took commands from the company commander. So it went on, the sort of hierarchical system of the army.
And to wrap it all up, what would happen if the commander was hit, if he was killed, because he's the most...
Well, if the tank commander was killed, which is quite common, one of the most dangerous things at one stage of the Second World War was that the tank commander had his head out of the turret, because you couldn't, in theory, we could fight our tanks closed down, as it was called, which meant all the hatches were shut, and you were looking through a prism in front of you, which had very little visibility. You could hardly see where you were going. So, I understand in the war, it was never the done thing to fight closed down. The commander always kept his head out. So, not infrequently, the tank commander was shot in the head, or a shell going by would have sent shrapnel into his head. So that was a dangerous thing to do, but you had to do it. Fortunately, I never went to war, so I never had that experience. But it was yes, you sat there. You had a seat which would go up and down. You had a lever which allowed you to drop down into the tank, or you could sort of zip it up so you were sitting nicely out. You also had a machine gun in front of you, fixed to the turret of the tank, which you could fire independently.
Did you ever use it?
Yes, I think it was. We also had machine guns. The main armament of the tank, in our case, was a 20-pounder gun, a very, very good gun. And they also had machine guns mounted coaxially, which meant that they followed the same line of fire as the main gun would have done. So if you raised the main gun, the auxiliary machine guns. But we did have one in front of us as well. Now, I had one interesting experience. We were driving down a road in the training area, which was a sort of sandy, peppery track. I fired off my big machine gun, which was great fun, and then suddenly the bullets came winging over my head. So they'd been hitting the rocks in front and coming whizzing back, so I stopped. The nearest thing I ever had to gunfire in anger.
So,
Now then, odd little things that you had to do as commander of a tank. Now, once a year we'd go off to a firing range at a place called Hona, which was in fact very close to Belsen concentration camp. And as an aside, when Belsen concentration camp was discovered at the end of the Second World War, or towards the end of the Second World War, the 11th Armour Division was leaguered nearby, it was called. They were all sitting there, and a German officer came out in an equivalent of a jeep and came up and said, "I think you should come with me. There is an area here which is, how did they put it? I can't remember. It's an area where people who are very ill are being quarantined. It's a very dangerous place. You really shouldn't go near it." So the British Army officer got in his jeep with the chap, and they went along, drove up to the entrance to what is the Belsen concentration camp, and they opened the gates, and they were met by this sight of people starving to death, piles of dead bodies. So they immediately sent back to headquarters what they'd found, and the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment and the Royal Armour, the 11th Armoured Division were the first people to relieve a concentration camp at the end of the Second World War. And I went there myself when we were nearby, and at that time there were graves with just long mounds of earth with a little sign on top saying something like, "Here lie 6,000 bodies," or "Here lie 3,000 bodies." If you were to go there today, you'd find it much smarter. The mounds of earth are now, I think, covered with stone, and it's all very smart, but it was a funny old part of the world. The other thing I mentioned en passant, you probably ran out of recording.
yeah.
Go on.
No, I was just going to say, well, in the army, in the regiment, I was an officer, we had a mess, what's called an officer's mess, where you ate and you could relax and play billiards or something. And we had mess servants who were almost invariably Germans who'd been clearly fighting in the war because they were in their 30s or 40s. And Herman the German, who was the mess waiter, we always used to like and ask him where he'd been in the war. And they always said we were on the Eastern Front. Winding up.
Okay. All right.
Thank you for watching the video, and please do like and subscribe this video and share it so we can get more popularity on our YouTube channel.